Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Know Your Dunes, an educational community webinar. This webinar is being hosted by the Humboldt Coastal Dunes Cooperative, and we are recording this meeting. Oh, excuse me. I would like to start by acknowledging that the coastal dune environments the Humboldt Coastal Dunes Cooperative is working to conserve are located in the ancestral unceded territory of the Wiyot people, which includes the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. Wiyot people continue to be stewards of the coastal environment surrounding Wigi, the Humboldt Bay, as they have been since time immemorial. One of the ways in which we can honor our placement within Wiyot territory is by recognizing the original names of these places in Silatluk, the Wiyot language. Names have existed long before the violent colonization of this area and attempted erasure of indigenous cultures and knowledge. The Wiyot tribe has a lot of great language resources on their website. I encourage you to look those up by visiting wiyot.us. November also happens to be Native American Heritage Month. With this in mind, I hope you'll consider making a contribution to the Honor Tax Project. The Honor Tax is a voluntary annual tax paid directly to the Wiyot Nation or other indigenous nations by people who occupy their traditional territories as a way of recognizing and respecting the sovereignty of Native nations. You can make a contribution or learn more by visiting honortax.org. Shown on your screen now are the Wiyot names for some of the communities and bodies of water surrounding Wigi, the Humboldt Bay. I'm joining you from Jarojiji, Eureka, and I encourage you to share in the chat where you are tuning in from. And if not in Wiyot territory, what territory you are tuning in from, if you know it. So some quick housekeeping before we get started. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and you have been automatically muted upon entry. Please stay muted during the presentations and feel free to keep your cameras off. I appreciate you joining us during this dinner hour, but feel free to get comfortable and you don't need to have your video on. We will have time for questions after each presentation, and at that point you can either type questions into the chat, which you can do throughout the presentation, and I will read those off to the presenters. Or you can unmute yourself during the Q&A period and ask your question directly. Feel free to use the chat to communicate with each other and the presenters. And with that, I just want to once again acknowledge that this is being hosted by the Humboldt Coastal Dunes Cooperative, which facilitates coordinated ecosystem management of coastal dune environments through collaboration among stakeholders. I won't read you our whole mission here, but these are some of the agencies and organizations involved in this group. We meet quarterly, and we also have one public meeting a year, which this webinar is serving as our public meeting to share some project updates. Today's presentations include the Humboldt Coastal Resilience Project Vulnerability Assessment with Ian Walker and Andrea Pickart, Greater Fritillary Butterfly Conservation in Northern California. Oops, I'm sorry, Clint, I messed up. Somehow that says Ian Walker again. It is actually Clint Pogue of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And unfortunately, we are not going to have the presentation about the Ocean Ranch Unit Restoration Project progress update this time around. The staff who were planning to do that presentation had some family emergencies come up and were unable to complete that presentation. So we're sorry about that. Hopefully next year we will get a presentation update about the Ocean Ranch Unit, where some really cool restoration projects are happening out there. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop my share. And with that, I will invite Ian to come on and share his screen.
Susie, where is my screen? There it is. Okay. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your evening to come and join us and see some updates from us anyway on the coastal vulnerability assessment and the work that's behind it. Some of you may remember a similar presentation from last year. These are updated results. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the project, it's sorry, I'm trying to hide a screen here so I can see my screen. There we go. This is a project that began, I believe, in 2018, funded by USCC grant and the California OPC to help assess and guide adaptation to sea level rise for the region, focusing specifically on the barrier itself. And I'll explain what a barrier is in a second, but it's basically this narrow stretch of land that we've partitioned up into 13 different study reaches. And we're using a common approach. Okay, I did not do that. That's interesting. But we've included not only in environmental variables, but socioeconomic variables as well. And we basically tally up across this geography how those different variables behave within these units to come up with a cumulative assessment. So in terms of, and sorry, that the vulnerability assessment itself is one specific objective in the broader HCRP program, which is objective 4. So what we're doing here is we chose a list of 22 variables that are all indicators for exposure of the barrier to sea level rise and related erosion and flooding. And then we aggregate those variables. We basically add them up to get different types of vulnerabilities to sea level rise, and then we cumulatively roll that up into an overall vulnerability assessment. So what you'll see tonight are basically a bunch of maps of those variables aggregated and displayed geographically. The table that you see on the right here indicates all 22 variables in the first column, and the subgroupings for those variables. So our physical variables here, largely geomorphic and geological and oceanographic. Our biological variables are natural hazards relevant to the barrier, sociocultural indicators, and various infrastructure attributes. And I should say too that the data sources behind these are all available, derived locally, statewide, or federally, but commonly available data sets for the most part, and some of which we or other contractors have produced for the project in specific. So all of these variables were mapped at roughly 100-meter resolutions, and then are scaled up depending on the variable and depending on the availability of those variables. Not all of these variables are available at that resolution, hence why we scale them up to the larger reaches. And then we derive the vulnerability scores for those. And now we're in a series of outreach and public consultation workshops. So this is, I think, our third or so of these. We had a stakeholder workshop last week or the week before, and we're using that information too to bring in local knowledge to the process to help verify. So this is just one example of a few variables, how they're ranked and quantified over a scale, in this case from 0 to 5, a 5-point scale. And you can see, for example, different types of landforms are derived or produce different vulnerability values. So low-lying beaches, salt marshes, and estuaries are most exposed to sea level rise because they're low-lying. Water is not vulnerable because it is the culprit, so to speak. Whereas steep uplands and more stabilized back barrier environments that are higher elevation have a lower vulnerability, and so on. So you can see for our shoreline erosion or accretion rates, different categories here. Relative sea level rise, which I'll explain in a minute, that does vary across or along the barrier. And other socioeconomic and infrastructure variables, like how long it takes emergency responders to reach a site along the barrier, or the types of infrastructure that are at or in very close proximity to the barrier. And the rankings statewide or countywide for the use and access that those infrastructure offer. Okay, so these are the types of maps we're going to be looking at tonight, and I'll just orient you again. You can see the study reaches from 1 up in Little River down to Centerville Beach, number 13. These reaches were all identified based largely on their geomorphology and shoreline erosion or retreat, shoreline erosion or progradation trends. So whether they're retreating or moving seaward. So based on those data, largely, we came up with these smaller study reaches, and they progress in number from north to south. And then within those, we gathered the available data. Sometimes you'll see the data plotted as little stripes across the unit. What that does is assign a value based on, in this example here on the far left, population density, published data on population density at roughly a 100-meter width for the frontal shoreline. Now, as many of you know, the bays themselves have had their own vulnerability assessments done. So we're just focusing on the barrier here. So for population density, you can see scores 2, 3, and 4 that relate to the population density generally on the barrier and where that population density exists. And in the middle, we've got roads and transportations of different ranking and proximity. So you can see up in Little River far to the north, you know, that reach intersects with Highway 101, so it receives a pretty high ranking. And then we've got, of course, the roads out on the barrier near Manila and Samoa. We've got the Coast Guard station, we've got the jetties, and so on and so forth. And then on the far right here, we have land use. Now, this is not our interpretation of land use. This is based on kind of a state assessment. And you can see different categorizations here. And basically, the denser and higher value of the land use, the higher the vulnerability for a certain parcel. So just pick a parcel of interest or parcels of interest to you. And, you know, think about the geography of those sites. What's there that you know of? What's there that you think is valuable or less valuable as we roll through these maps? So I decided first to present some of the more social and economic variables, because, you know, many people can relate more easily to those than some of the biological or geomorphic. Okay, so this map here indicates the relative scores for the geomorphic types in the area. So if we've got coastal lowlands, beaches, salt marshes, and estuaries, for example, these are areas that are more susceptible to flooding and erosion. Now, these are also areas that are quite dynamic too, in terms of their ability to adjust and respond to sea level. So we have to keep in mind that we're adding these variables up. And so if we have a dynamic environment susceptible to flooding, where we have critical infrastructure, that area cumulatively will become more vulnerable as we add more variables into the mix, if that makes sense. Here are the shoreline erosion and accretion trends. The northern portion is derived from work by Kelsey McDonald and the southern portion by GHD. And these indicate, again, the either growth seaward. So these lighter colors indicate shorelines that have been moving seaward over time, and the red are retreating or eroding. So again, pick your favorite parcel or parcels and kind of place that into context. And this is derived from historic aerial photographs that go back to the 30s. And then third, another physical variable here is the width of the barrier itself. So it's one thing to be high and proud as a foredune, but if you're very narrow and surrounded by lowlands, then you're going to be more susceptible to erosion and removal with sea level rise, as opposed to areas that have massive expansive dunes, for example, like in Reach 4 at Landfear. One of the main driving factors of how quickly sea level will rise in our region depends on what the Earth's crust itself is doing. Many of you are familiar with earthquakes in the region. They happen very, very frequently. And of course, you know, in 1700, we had a very large one. These motions of the crust, tectonics, if you like, also cause vertical lift or fall in certain areas. And there are other factors that cause that, but the dominant factor here is the location to the Mendocino Triple Junction to the south, north of which we enter the Cascadian subduction zone, where the plates are locked and the land is uplifting. So what this map shows us here in the green and yellow colors are areas that are uplifting, and in the south, areas that are sinking. So you can imagine if you're sinking tectonically and sea level is rising around you, then relative sea level is actually rising faster than areas in the north that are trying to emerge out of the sea, or maybe outpacing sea level rise. So if we take that value of vertical land motion, and this is derived from satellites back into the mid 2010s, and we subtract that from the rate of regional sea level rise, we end up with what's called the relative sea level rise map. So first take-home point from this map is that all areas are seeing sea level rise. So although the northern portion of the study area is slowly rising tectonically, sea level rise is overpacing that. So what we see here in terms of relative sea level rise rates is we have slower rates of about 3 to 3.5 millimeters per year in the north to much higher rates in excess of 5 millimeters per year or so. And a transition right around the end of the North Spit and at the jetties itself. What does this mean for the future? Well, if we take our current value for our mean monthly maximum water level, and this is derived from NOAA data sets back to 1982, so a 40-year record, and we take projected values published by NOAA and by the California State guidance document in 2018, which are these plus values, and we flood those on the terrain, we can get a general idea of areas that are going to be in trouble sooner than others. And so the map on the left here shows you areas that are currently flood prone during our maximum water levels. So not surprisingly, areas of the Mad River estuary and outflow, lower lying beach areas, some of the back barrier areas. Now we didn't extend into the bays themselves because that assessment's already been done, but we did focus on areas on the back barrier. So you can see in sections 9 and 10, some areas that are quite exposed already. And so the lighter the color, the more distant the warning, if you like. But if there's color anywhere on this plot, it's likely that those areas will see flooding first. If they're behind foredunes, like some of these areas here, these are areas that could also be subject to groundwater flooding. As sea level rises, of course, so too does the water table. So that's kind of a double whammy, if you like. So we've looked at the variables. Now we're going to look at some of the subgroupings of vulnerability, and then we'll roll it up to the comprehensive vulnerability that is all 22 variables combined. So what we do is we aggregate the scores that are derived from these subgroupings of variables into maps that represent overall environmental vulnerability that includes our geological, our biological, and our hazards, and then the socioeconomic vulnerability related to cultural aspects and social use and infrastructure. So all of the environmental variables combined give us this map here. And you can basically follow the colors to your favorite reaches and see roughly from an environmental perspective alone what the vulnerability is. Now keep in mind behind this is all of these variables. We've got 1, 2, 3, we've got like 12 different variables that are environmental. So if one's high, and that's something you're most familiar with, yet your reach is scored kind of mid to low, keep in mind that all those other variables are also playing a role and they're equally weighted at this point. And similarly for socioeconomic vulnerability, so cultural sites, which we do not show, but we are aware of where they are, population density, which I showed you earlier, as well as land use as ranked. You add up those values and we have our social cultural, and then we've got our different response, emergency response and infrastructure variables here. So if we put these two maps together, we end up with a comprehensive vulnerability map. So areas that are low or in green colors are so because of the 22 or so variables in the mix, most of them, or a good portion of them, were below kind of average values. Whereas areas that are yellow or in red colors, these are the most highly vulnerable areas. And again, weighted by all of these factors combined. So clearly areas that have a lot of infrastructure, population, erosion rates, relative sea level rise that's high, very quickly light up as areas of concerns. And I would treat this map just as that, as an areas of concern map, but not to say that these other areas that are in green are not important or also areas of concern. So with that, I'll take any questions we might have on the vulnerability assessment, and then we'll roll into the second half where Andrea is going to speak a little bit more about some of the on-the-ground work we've been doing on the dunes and barrier itself. I can't see anybody or hear anybody, so hopefully you're all still there.
Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or type it in the chat. Just give it another 30 seconds or so.
Hi
I
there.
also can't see the chat, so if there's
Yep.
anything in the chat, just let me know.
Okay, we've got a question from Jen Colt, sounds like.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain why you use the mean monthly maximum water. I see different things. Then I'm just wondering why use that rather than mean higher high water or mean
Yeah.
annual high water.
Yeah, that's a good question. We spoke with Alderon Laird and Jeff Anderson, and to be consistent with what's been done for the other vulnerability assessments, we settled on that value. And then our value is derived from a slightly longer and more current epoch than those previous studies. So the value is a little different, not a whole lot different from what was used prior. And I think the epochs used for those were 1982 to 2001. And we know that in the last 20 years or so, we've had some pretty significant high water years, in particular, the El Nino of 2015-16 and the year following 2017, we had really high water levels. So those are captured in this longer epoch. Does that answer your question?
It does, although I haven't really seen other vulnerability assessments that use mean maximum monthly water, and so that's why I asked. So you just did it to be consistent with what's already been done here, but have you seen that done elsewhere?
Well, in other studies I've been involved in, we've used a couple different things. We've used mean higher high water. We've used annual maximum, and those are kind of two different, almost different ends of the spectrum. You know, if we think about if we want to be more conservative or avoidant, then we might want to pick a value that's a little higher than the mean higher high water level. Because the mean higher high water level, you know, it's below the toe of the foredune for most areas along the barrier. So it's not really a threshold for erosion or flooding per se, whereas the mean monthly max water level gets a little closer to what starts to cause concern. And it captures the estuaries really well, and those are some of the first places to flood. It captures the leading edge along the low-lying beaches and in the marshes a little bit. So that's why that's why I would go with that value, and I'm pretty sure we're consistent with what Alderon and others have used in the other assessments.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
We have one more question in the chat, Ian, which actually maybe I can answer it. Barbara is asking which zone is the fish farm going to be in? And I believe that is zone 7. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that is the proposed, I'm blanking on the name of the company right now, but the proposed fish farm out south of Samoa.
Okay, I was unaware of the fish farm. Cool.
This is Craig. I've got a question. Can you hear me?
Hi, Craig.
Yeah. I was just wondering did you combine, do any of these metrics combine like triple disturbance type of conditions where you might have a 100-year storm and severe waves at a king tide type of condition? Did you look at sort of those extreme conditions?
No, again, you know, we chose a scenario that is a quite likely and fairly frequent event, as opposed to a less frequent event. And then when we think about the scenarios for the future in terms of the guidance document, those additive values, I don't know where my cursor went, but the plus values that you see in this table here, those are derived for a medium to high risk scenario. So, you know, communities are choosing that kind of more extreme end for the additive values to kind of trigger areas of concern for critical infrastructure and major impacts. So, you know, you can pick two different things. You can pick a different datum and a different epoch, which are the top values in 2022. And you can pick a different future scenario based on, you know, what the IPCC emissions scenarios are, or based on what the different levels of risk are, which is what the OPC document, the California Sea Level Rise Guidance document has done. And I'd be happy to pass a link on for that document if you haven't seen it. And they go into much more detail on that. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Any other questions?
Okay, yeah, if there are no other questions, let's transition over to Andrea's PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. We can do that. Yep.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Ian, were you going to start that? I apologize if I cut you off too soon there.
That's okay. I was just going to give a little bit of context. Most of you are very familiar with the beautiful dunes we have up in Humboldt, and they're very special, and they provide a lot of ecosystem services, which is why and flood control, erosion control, and sea level rise protection are a few of them, but you can imagine more. These have been forming and maintained along the coast for as long as we know, in response to sea level changes. And the response of the barrier would be to continually rise and roll landward with sea level rise, as it has done over the Holocene. And in the early Holocene, 12,000 years ago or so, or back to the retreat of the last glacial age, sea level globally was about 100 meters lower than it is today. Now it's risen since then, and most of what we've seen in the last 5,000 to 8,000 years has been fairly steady sea level, with rates that are, about 1.5 millimeters per year. And now we're facing rates that are much faster than that. So the barriers are dynamic, and they've constantly moved with that, but now our barriers are very developed and need that sand supply and need that accommodation space to do what they do. So there's lots of sand out there, as we know, maintaining them. And we know that the land is moving up in the north and down in the south, and that gives us this relative sea level trend that we talked about and saw earlier. But we also know that the barrier is plagued with some invasive plants that really change the dynamic of those frontmost dunes, or foredunes we call them. And some of the work that Andrea and I have done on the foredunes, where invasive plants have been removed and native species have come back in, have really highlighted how resilient these foredunes can be in the absence of invasive plants. And I'll let Andrea talk more about that. And it's all about resilience, essentially, the ability of the foredune to do its thing. So when we say resilience in the context of a coastal dune barrier, what we mean is how able is the dune to maintain itself in the face of disturbance and recover to its previous form and function. And you can see in many developed areas, as in here in Oregon, and on the lower right near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where we have so much development and other engineering pressures on the foredunes, they can't maintain themselves and they've lost their form and function. And now we're having all sorts of flood and erosion problems. So as an adaptation and resilience perspective, dunes provide an essentially free buffer against erosion, flooding, and sea level rise, provided that we can maintain their sand supply and their function. And there are lots of examples out there, and this is a real buzzword in the state and elsewhere right now, on using nature-based solutions. So foredune restoration is a good example to help shorelines regain their geomorphology and their ecological function, which we know can be very resilient in terms of the impacts of sea level rise. But not all living shoreline approaches, that's another term that's been thrown around and used a lot, are resilient approaches. And with resilience, we need dynamics. So we need sand to be able to be eroded and then recover and move back in to the dunes and up and over the dunes. If these dunes are going to keep pace with sea level rise, they need to be able to function properly. So Andrea is going to talk now about what we've been doing to track the barrier performance and foredunes throughout Humboldt Bay. You can now take the mic away from me, Susie.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Everyone can see my screen. This is I'm going to take some time to go over some of the results of our 5-year cross-shore transects that we did along the littoral cell. These were topographic measurements that were taken from the back dune down into the beach at intervals of 2 to 4 meters. using RTK GPS. The picture is of Candace Reynolds, who was the field coordinator, taking a measurement with her radio there, talking to another one and determining the elevation that she's measuring. We did these twice a year, summer and winter, for 5 years. We had 72 of these transects spread all along the littoral cell. The goal was to capture variation in geomorphology and other variables. And I'm just going to show you some representative profiles that are characteristic of stretches of shoreline, because I don't want to show you 72 slides. I want to orient you to the graph shown here, because they're all going to look something like this. The ocean is on the left here. The y-axis is the height of the feature that you're measuring, and that axis will stay constant through all the slides, so you can get a sense of how the height of the floor dune varies along the littoral cell. And then I have 2 lines. One is the dotted line, which represents the first summer of our study, and one is a solid line, which represents the last summer. So this gives you kind of a net idea of the sand movement over that period. And then over here in the map, I show the location of the graph in the littoral cell. So this first one is Little River. It's the restored area in Little River. Little River has a lot of sediment delivery, and that's at least partly because it's the highest of the vertical land motion areas on our study area. So it's rising more quickly. And you can see that there's sand moving all along this profile, boat all the way from the beach to the back dune. This was restored using heavy equipment, which takes off the vegetation cover, and the vegetation comes back, in this case, as distinct mounds or hummocks or nebka, whatever you want to call them, surrounded by a lot of moving sand. But overall, you can see that there's been a net addition of elevation. And just to illustrate that, here's some large wood on the beach in 2019. And then just 1 year later, you can see that wood is getting buried. And there's also some Elamis mollis, the native dune grass, coming in. The Mad River Beach area, these are very high foredunes. You can see they're up around 10 or 11 meters high, and they were scarped before we started our study, and then continued to scarp during the study. When you have a high foredune like this, it's difficult for it to recover because the sand has to build back up on the beach and create a sand ramp that eventually reaches the top of the scarp, which in this case is really high up there. So over our 5 years, we didn't see any recovery here, but we saw 1 meter or 10 meters of elevation, or coastline retreat. And this is just a picture showing what it looks like in the winter. And then this is the following summer, no recovery. You can still see that log sticking out. I wanted to show this because this is the Landfear Adaptation Site, which is where we did a study looking at the resiliency of restored dunes. So this front foredune had been built by Ammophila, and we took the Ammophila off and planted native species. And then over the ensuing years, you can see that there's been deposition both on the front of the foredune and the lee side of the foredune. So we've had a widening of the foredune. Although you can't see it on this graph, we also had elevation gain. So we have altogether more volume, which is a more resilient characteristic. This site, as well as most of the rest of the littoral cell, scarped or cliffed during that first the 2015-16 El Nino and then the 2017 storm Ian referred to. So this was the 2017 scarp. And you can see that by summer of the next year, it's completely healed, unlike what we saw up at the Mad River Beach. Now we're down at the Landfear Dunes. So this is really representative of the area from Landfear down to Malel and BLM. There's a tendency in this stretch to form incipient foredune, which is this feature right here at the base of the established foredune. This is an ephemeral feature that builds up during quiet years and then erodes away during storm years. During the period that we looked at this, the incipient foredune was completely washed away, but it happened incrementally with scarping. And you can see that the scarps released sand that then moved up the front of the foredune and actually increased the elevation of part of the foredune. So the incipient foredunes are a resilient feature because they protect the established foredune. And in this case, they were able to move sand out of the incipient foredune onto the established foredune. This is a picture with the incipient foredune. It doesn't look very obvious in this picture, but it's the right part of the picture. And this is 3 years later with the incipient foredune gone. Now I'm jumping down to Fairhaven, which is an area of vertical loss or elevation loss in the barrier. And you can see that we had a very dramatic shoreline retreat here of 30 meters here. And I can tell you that New Navy Base Road is right about here, right where the end of the line is. So this is presenting a threat to that road. There was no recovery in this area. The first picture shows prior to the large scarp that happened here, and this is afterwards. Now down on the south spit, we saw mostly neutral to elevation gain on the foredune or incipient foredune. In this case, you see an incipient foredune forming. This was an Ammophila-dominated dune. That's in 2017 without an incipient foredune, and now in 2020, you can see this incipient foredune has formed. I'm skipping down to the Eel River Wildlife Area, the north barrier of the Eel River. And this was an interesting site because it gets a lot of large wood during storm events out of the Eel River. And we did have 2 big storm events. So this feature here, which is an incipient foredune, is actually built by large wood, which you can see in the picture there. That's after the first delivery of wood, actually the second delivery of wood. And then a year later, you can see the sand filling in the holes around the wood and vegetation coming in. Now I've jumped down to the end. Actually, my map is wrong, I think. Oh, maybe not. We're down at Centerville Beach or just north of that on the Eel River Estuary Preserve. There were several foredune breaches that occurred down here. This is at the very lowest end of the vertical land motion gradient. So the land is sinking and there appears to be a sediment deficit. The foredune washed away and was deposited back here in an overwash fan. And then what's left is now just a beach berm. So this will be continued to be washed over in later winters. So this is extremely high vulnerability. And this is a picture taken of behind the foredune in 2017, and no foredune to be seen in 2020. So now I wanted to take a few minutes since we've suggested that restoration is one of the adaptation strategies for coastal dunes in our region. And I wanted to just review some of the restoration projects. I'm focusing on Lanfear and Malel. And this is the extent of European beach grass and when it was removed. So you can see there was just a small amount in the northern part of the project area. And that was all removed early in the 1990s. So really, Ammophila never really got a toehold up there. The orange is the Lanfear restoration project that happened from 92 to 97. And then the red is down at Malel from 2004 to 2009. And you can see that with the Malel project, the Ammophila had that much longer to colonize, and it's out in the deflation plain and even the transgressive dune field. So this first project, the 92 to 98 on the Landfear Dunes, was done with mechanical methods, digging the European beach grass up, letting it resprout, digging the resprouts before they have a chance to photosynthesize much. So you're eventually starving the underground rhizomes of their carbohydrates and the plants die. When we did this, it was the first project of its kind, so we weren't really sure what to expect in the way of sand movement. So we used a patchwork pattern to remove it. It turned out that we didn't really need to do that because in areas where you have a lot of relictual natives hanging out in the Ammophila, they come back very quickly. So this is a time series photo. You can see the before on the left, and then I think it's the right is 2010, but I can't see it on my screen. The incipient foredune is gone on the upper right picture because we had a major La Nina 2008 to 10, which created a lot of erosion. So not just El Niños, but La Niñas can do that. And in 2014, you see the incipient foredune has reformed. This is another one starting with the point of time where the Ammophila has been taken off. You can see an incipient foredune that still has the Ammophila, which was removed. This is 2 years later. We've got native plants returning. We still have an incipient foredune. 2001, which is what I meant to say last time, I guess. Sorry about that. So the La Nina was 1998 to 2000. And we lost our incipient foredune there and saw some cliffing. And here by 2014, it's back. But if I were to take that picture today, the incipient foredune would be gone again. So it's cycling and it's following the storm patterns. Now for the Millel Dunes restoration, again, the invasion of Ammophila had proceeded farther. You can see it growing up in the moving dunes in the back of the picture. This looked different than the Landfear restoration project. There was a foredune, an Ammophila built foredune in front of the old Ammophila invaded foredune. When you took off the vegetation, you can see the difference. There's remnant plants in the native foredune and none in the Ammophila foredune, which is extremely steep. We did have some scarping happen in this project. The scarping is going to happen regardless of what vegetation you have present, but its recovery can depend on the vegetation. We decided in this project, because we had so little native plants coming back on that bare foredune, to plant Elamis mollis to help it along. That's our native dune grass. So we did that manually. And now I'll show you some time series of this. This is before. 2 years later, again, not a lot of vegetation except for Cockylie, which is a non-native but not persistent species that comes in after restoration. In 2011, we had planted the Elamis the year before, and in 2014, you can see how much the Elamis has spread. Similar site here, the Elamis has been planted, and here's how it has spread. So it does very well. Just a review of where restoration is happening on the barriers from north to south. Up here at Little River, we have the restoration project that I talked about during the Transects. That was done using heavy equipment. We have planned restoration here on our new Wadul unit at Humboldt Bay National Wildlife Refuge. This is the Landfear and Millel dunes, including the North and South Millel, have all been restored. And then Friends of the Dunes is in progress. Then down on the south part of the study area, the South Spit has been restored by the BLM. I think they're still moving north with that. And the Eel River Wildlife Area has just started their restoration. So I mentioned there are different methods to do this. This is the manual removal I already talked about. Up at Little River, they used heavy equipment. That can be done. Each of these methods has its own pluses and minuses, and every site is different. So what you want at one site might be different than what you want at another site. This is a combination of burning and herbicide, which is planned for the Eel River Wildlife Area. And then some projects, including our planned restoration project, will be using revegetation because of the fact that we're now restoring dunes that have been so heavily degraded that they have no native plants nearby even. So that's the end, and I can take questions if anybody has them.
Andrea, I don't have a question, but I just want to make a comment. I mean, wow, well done. This is very inspiring to see. And I know how many hundreds and thousands of hours have gone into all these restoration projects, but particularly the 5 years of cross-shore transects. I mean, that's just incredible information for us along the littoral cell to help understand how dunes work better relative to resilience. I've been looking forward to this, your study being done, and I know I'm not getting all the details tonight, but I'm really pleased with the increase of my own understanding. Thank you.
Sure. And, what I reported today was really qualitative results, and there are still to be done quantitative analysis of the transects. So that'll be coming later. Anybody else? Okay, I will unshare my screen.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And we had a comment in the chat about how powerful those before and after images are. So thank you for sharing all of those. Okay, so next up, hope you stick around, please, because we have a really great presenter next. Clint Pogue with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been working with some Fritillary butterflies and is going to give us an update on those conservation efforts. All right, take it away, Clint.
Thanks, Susie. So I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and there are 2 listed greater fritillaries in our area. I'm going to be telling you a little bit about both of those today, going into a lot more about one of them and the work that we've been doing over the past year or so. First, want to give a little bit of background about sort of how we're approaching conservation for these species and what we're doing. So one of the aspects or one of the roles of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to implement the Endangered Species Act. And the purpose of the act is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems upon which they depend. So we co-administer the act with the National Marine Fisheries Service. Roughly, the NMFS works with the marine organisms, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service works with terrestrial and non-marine aquatic organisms. Sometimes that line can be a little bit blurred, but generally that's how it works. But really, I want to focus on these 2 words, the protect and recover. You can sort of think of those as the 2 arms of the act. The protect, that's environmental regulation, that's permitting, working with other agencies to make sure that impacts to endangered species are lower, and then recovery, and that's actually what I'm going to be focused on today, and that's improving the status of the species. That's making things better. That's improving populations, improving habitat, and actually working to bring those species up to the point where they can either be downlisted, and that is going from endangered to threatened, or delisted, and that's removing the species from the endangered species list because they're doing so much better than they were. But it's really helpful to have some benchmarks, some things to go shoot for, and also some things to be accountable for, since we are a government agency. So what is recovery? Well, we have some guidelines, or at least some things that we shoot for with these recovery criteria. And they're benchmarks that help us determine, okay, can this species be reclassified? Can it be shifted from endangered to threatened, or from threatened to removed from the list? So here are some recovery criteria for one of the butterflies that we work with in our region, the Oregon silver spot butterfly. So the first criterion here is that there needs to be at least 10 viable populations in protected habitat through the range. And then those habitats need to be managed long-term to maintain the native early successional grassland communities that the butterflies inhabit and rely upon. And that managed habitat at each population supports a minimum viable population of 200 to 500 butterflies for at least 10 years. So if you look at these criteria, there's really sort of like sub-criteria within each one. So looking at that first one, there's at least 10 viable populations, all right? Not just 10 populations, but 10 viable populations. So we need data to determine, okay, is this population viable? Can it exist with little to minimal maintenance? And is that in protected habitat? You know, these populations need to exist in protected habitat. That normally is reflected in public areas or areas in land trusts. And those habitats need to be managed long-term. But really, I'd like to move on to point 3. There's sort of a nuance here that I'd like to point out, that each population needs to support a minimum of 200 to 500 butterflies. And at first when I saw that, I thought it was kind of wonky, because a minimum, you know, I would think a minimum is one number. And it made a little bit more sense when zooming out and looking at these populations. Some of them were just naturally larger than others, whereas some populations might only be able to support 300 butterflies. Well, we couldn't have a minimum of 500 at that location. So that's why we have this range here. And we can apply these numbers specifically to each population throughout the range. So a little bit of background about this butterfly. It's in the genus Pickart, and that genus, Pickart, is the greater fritillaries. Every single butterfly in this genus is obligate to some type of violet. That means that the larvae, the caterpillars for these butterflies, that's all they eat, the leaves of a certain type of violet. Those violets vary by range and by species and subspecies. The violet that these butterflies specifically rely on, the Oregon silver spots, I should say, are Viola adunca, the early blue violet. These butterflies can be found in grassland habitats within 12 miles of the coast from Westport, Washington. So that's southwest Washington to Lake Earl, California, northwest California, in 3 different habitat types: coastal prairies, stabilized dunes, and montane grasslands. So these butterflies, they tend to not be found where the dunes are more dynamic, but more in the back dunes up at Lake Earl. These butterflies are univoltine, meaning there's only one time per year where these butterflies exist in the adult form. Univoltine means one flight. So they only fly one time per year. And they're non-migratory. The monarchs are a really cool species, extremely beautiful, you know, a great ambassador for Lepidoptera conservation. But they are a pretty unique butterfly at that, in that they have a migratory pattern. Most butterflies are not migratory. Most butterflies, you can see their whole world from a hilltop. So that's one thing that I like to point out, that these butterflies, they really rely on the habitats that are there. They don't have much of an option of moving to an area of better habitat, because that's just not in their natural history to do so. Then we have the closely related barren silver spot butterfly. If you look, it's in the same species, just different subspecies as the Oregon silver spot, but this one is endangered. It's found in the coastal prairies of Mendocino and Sonoma counties, and it has a really similar life history. Univoltine, caterpillars only eat the leaves of Viola adunca, non-migratory, but we've had consistently low counts, and there's a much more restricted range for this species. So that's really where I'm going to dive into the work that we've been doing with the Fish and Wildlife Service, our partnership with Sequoia Park Zoo, the Bureau of Land Management, California State Parks, and wind coastal planning in Mendocino County. So these are going to be the results from our augmentation efforts, our first year of that. So first, just diving in, why augmentation? But even before that, what is augmentation? Augmentation is bringing individuals into an area where they already exist, trying to increase densities, increase numbers. So why are we doing this? Well, in 2020, our standardized transect surveys detected no individuals across any transect, and we had only one confirmed incidental sighting of the butterfly. So with this, that was extremely concerning because one of the goals of the Endangered Species Act is to prevent extinction. So I took this as a top priority. This is something that we absolutely need to do. We need to ensure that we had funding, logistics, and environmental compliance in place so that we could potentially collect these butterflies, bring them in for captive rearing efforts, and augment that population. This augmentation helps buffer the populations against stochastic events, such as extreme weather events, flooding, and other things that are just unpredictable. So we have sort of a safeguarded population in captivity, hopefully year after year, that if something awful were to happen, we would have some source that we would be able to repopulate the landscape with. And also, this helps us buy more time and flexibility for habitat restoration. While we're working on increasing the numbers, we can also be working in habitats where we've known them to occur or have the necessary resources to support this species and increase that habitat quality so that we can reach our recovery goals, which includes multiple populations of thousands of butterflies, something we're very, very far away from right now. So first, how does augmentation work? Well, there's 4 steps. I'm going to dive into each of these more here in a second. But first is collecting mated females from the wild. So this is different than captive breeding. Captive breeding, the mating would occur in captivity, and that's not the case here. The individuals mate in the wild, and then we collect those mated females, bring them into captivity at Sequoia Park Zoo, where they are allowed to lay eggs. And then those eggs are cared for through each of the stages of caterpillar development, all the way through to pupation. And then we release those pupae in the field. So diving in more to each of these steps. First up, collection. This is one of the most, well, they're all sort of nerve-wracking parts, but this is one of the most nerve-wracking ones for me, because if you can't find them, then there's no other way to get these butterflies. And we've been noticing seasonal shifts in the flight season. In 2020, our first detection of the butterfly was on July 24th. This year in 2022, that was on June 24th, a whole month earlier. So we are seeing some shifts in the phenology, and that's making this even more difficult. So out in the field, we're looking in the habitat for these butterflies flying around, at which point, if we can be so lucky, we net one and then look at the tip of the abdomen to determine the sex. Here in the net is a male. You can see sort of the claspers near the end of the abdomen. Unfortunately, I did not have a really good photo of the tip of a female abdomen, but you can see more of a hole where she lays her eggs from. But finding these butterflies being in the habitat, we also have to line that up with the conditions being right. And as coastal folks know, it can be really hard to thread that needle of no wind, sun, and just generally good butterfly conditions for there to be good activity for us to be able to find these butterflies. So once we've been able to capture them and identify their sex, we assess their likelihood of being mated. So on the right here is the first female that we had collected, the first barren silver spot female. And you can see on her right wing, there's a chunk missing. This could have been an attempted predation event that fortunately she escaped from, or it could have just been wear and tear. But regardless, to us, we see this butterfly has been out for a while, and that's increased her likelihood of being mated and her likelihood of already laying some eggs in the wild, which is something that we would prefer, because then there is some sort of, safeguard against our work as well. Bringing them in, we'd like to have some natural recruitment in the population as well. We're trying to supplement that, not replace it. So once we've collected them, determined that they're a suitable individual for captive rearing, we place them in a deli cup, which you can see here. It's not all that different from a takeout container, except it's got some holes at the top to allow for aeration, gas exchange, and a paper towel, just so that she can grip that and have a nice firm place to be secured during transport. So placed in the deli cup, and then they're placed at a cooler at 50 degrees, which is about the mean nighttime temperatures on the Mendocino coast. And then we transport them to Sequoia Park Zoo. At the zoo, the adult females are then transferred to paper bags, and it's in those bags where they spend most of their time for the rest of their life. They are provided a nutrient-rich artificial nectar. We've seen this to dramatically increase egg production. Those bags, still closed, of course, are placed out in the sun so that the females have some of that enrichment of the solar radiation, and that also encourages egg laying and egg development. So in these bags, the female is also placed in there with a violet leaf to stimulate egg laying, as well as strips of paper towels, and those simulate leaf litter, which is the locations for which the females tend to lay their eggs. So actually on here, you can see some of the sizes of these eggs. That's a violet leaf, and those yellow dots are butterfly eggs. We don't typically like to see it with the eggs on the violet like that, because there's a lot of added moisture from that violet leaf. But when they lay their eggs on their paper towels, it makes it a lot easier for the zoo to process. Here you can see paper towel strips cut up into triangles, and the dots at every single one of those are a butterfly egg. So these are extremely tiny, and the zoo has a lot to work with. I should say they have their work cut out for them when it comes to this, because oftentimes there's issues with mold coming in on these butterflies, or existent in facilities. Mold spores are everywhere. And so the zoo works to help clean the mold off these eggs underneath a high power stereoscope. But yeah, just a little bit larger photo. It still doesn't quite do it justice on just how small these are. So the eggs, they exist in their egg form for about 2 weeks, and then they hatch and eat their eggshell first off. And at that stage, they are what's considered a first instar caterpillar. Caterpillars go through stages of development just as there are discrete stages between the different life forms. Some butterflies have 4 instars, whereas the greater fritillaries tend to have about 6. So at this first instar, they're about the size of the year on a penny. So still extremely small. And so they eat their eggshell, and that's the only nutrients they have until the spring. And, that's quite a small meal to last, all those many months. But the caterpillars are just so small at that point that they can't get their mouth parts around the older, more established violet leaves that are around in late summer, early fall. So they enter a state of diapause or inactivity until the spring, where there's a lot more fresh growth on those violets that are very small leaves and very tender leaves. And then the caterpillars can get their mouth parts around that. But the zoo also is working to collect extremely small leaves at this point, and I have heard that it is quite tedious to do. So the caterpillars are continued to be fed by the zoo, progressing through each of their 6 instars, and they get extremely hungry. in those last 4th, 5th, and 6th instars. So lots of violets, lots of violet needs. I'm sorry, lots of violet leaves are needed at that point. And then you can see in this photo, there's caterpillars walking around. There's some violet leaves. And then there's those paper towels that are sort of taped to the sides. And those are pupa pockets. Those are designed for the caterpillar to be able to crawl up into and start their pupation. So they'll crawl up in there and then make a J formation, and then they will transform from caterpillar to pupa. Some people have had a misconception that, oh, they're inside, of this pupal casing, but that's only true at the very end. Whenever they transform from caterpillar to pupa, they are the pupa. They are completely liquid in there, except for these regions of cells called imaginal discs. And it's from those areas that the butterfly actually starts to form. So once these butterflies have pupated in late spring, early summer, then we transport them in their pupa pockets into the field. These pupa pockets are individually labeled so we can monitor eclosion rates as well as successes, even based on which ones came from which adult. So we're starting to collect some data. I think it's going to be really insightful in future years. And we employed 2 release cage designs, one open and one closed. I have some good photos of that on the next slide, so I'll tell you a little bit more about that then. But it's really best for the butterflies to be able to eclose into their natural habitat, because once they eclose, they're starting to be oriented. And it's best for them to do that initial orientation in the area where they're going to spend the rest of their life. And so that's why we release them as pupae and not as adults. Also, it's much easier to transport them as pupae because they're relatively more sturdy, easier to put in boxes and transport without harming them. So here's Dr. Chris Damiani in front of her release cage design. And we have 2 kinds. There's the green bucket, and that's our open cage design. The pupae are taped in their pupae pockets around the sides in there. And then there's a hole cut out in this bucket with a tree tube placed across it. That tree tube is meant to reduce predation events. Birds really don't like that tree tube, so it's less likely for birds to be able to get in there and eat our precious pupae. And then we have on the outside some nectar sources and a Gatorade bottle, and that's just to encourage the butterflies to leave that design. These are hung up in trees also to reduce predation pressures, and we have very good success with that this year. And they're really best used in places where we could only get there at less frequently. And so, okay, we have some pupae, we need to put them out in the field. We're going to put these in the open release cage because it's further away. But in areas that are much more accessible to us, we can do the closed cage design. And that's really beneficial for lots of reasons. 1, it nearly eliminates predation pressures. 2, it allows us to track individuals more easily with our data. And 3, it's just nice to be able to see them and let them out into their habitat, as adult butterflies. It's really rewarding, and it gives us some additional observations of just how they're looking when they're coming out of here. So in the lower left, we can see the open cage design. It's sort of dual layered. There's the hard inner layer, and that's just like a laundry tote with a hole cut in the side. And those pupae are strung in their pupae pockets along the inside. That's also to help reduce, make it harder for predators to get to these. And also, it's really nice to have that string because the butterflies like to hang upside down while they inflate their wings, because whenever they come out of the pupae, they have a very swollen abdomen, and then they squeeze that liquid into their wings to inflate them, and then they need to dry upside down to have their wings form properly. So this design works really well for that. And then we have the outer layer, the mesh, and that's really our predator proofing, or at least, predator resistance. And then also, just to add, because we are concerned about predation, we added a layer of chicken wire around the fence or around the cage, just as an added layer. We were able to collect a lot of great data from that this year. And here's our results from our inaugural year of captive rearing and augmentation. We collected 7 females from the wild in 2021. They laid 2,849 eggs, from which 1,561 of those hatched into first instar larvae. And eventually we were able to develop 107 of those into their pupal state. And then we were able to release 80 adults into the wild. So just to give you some perspective on this, in 2020, we just had 1 incidental sighting. In 2021, during our collection efforts, we refocused our efforts in some areas that were not covered by transects, and we saw about 40 to 50 individuals. And to be able to release, almost double what we had even seen in total the previous year is a great success, and something that I'm super proud of our partnership to be able to do this. But we're moving on too. It's like we want to do better. We want to really focus this on making it a recovery effort, and making sure that the status of this butterfly is always improving. So we're going to refine this in coming years. We want to work on the captive rearing protocol to more closely mimic the microclimate of Mendocino County. We've been focused on adapting an Oregon silver spot butterfly captive rearing process, which has been very successful since 2001. But there's things that we need to learn about barrens. In our first year, I think we learned a lot about that, and being able to time that with the natural emergence, I think is something that we're going to be able to do starting this coming year. Also, we plan to mark individuals upon release for a few reasons. One, we want to make sure that if we don't want to be collecting, individuals that we captive reared before, would be able to make that determination. We want to be able to bring in more wild individuals so that we're not sort of, homogenizing the genetics by year after year rearing the same genetic lines. But also, if we wanted to collect individuals that had been captive reared, we'd be able to do that too, to test their mating success and egg viability. We want to make sure that the butterflies that we're releasing into the field are just as fit and just as capable as wild butterflies. And we want to make sure that they're able to mate and have viable offspring. So that's something that we might be doing in future years. Also, we're planning on expanding our search for new populations and eventually incorporating into a larger genetic study of this population, as well as other sparia populations along the coast, all the way up to Oregon, looking at Oregon silver spot populations and seeing genetically how these butterflies are related to each other. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you all so much.
That was great. Thank you, Clint. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type them in the chat. I have one to start out with. I am wondering, how do you mark butterflies? You said that you would, moving forward, you're going to mark the butterflies, and I just don't know how that happens.
One of the best ways that we've found to do that is with a wide-tipped Sharpie, especially the silver, because it shows up well. We can tell it apart from the silver spots, but also it's reflective. We can see it through binoculars, and they've had some great success with that too, with Oregon silver spots.
Interesting. And does that last a while?
It'll last through the entirety of their life. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Hi, Clint. I have a weird question. So you showed a picture and you stated that you put the female butterflies in a paper bag so they can lay eggs. Why a paper bag? Really
I think it's because it's not going to allow much condensation on the walls. It helps create for a drier environment for the butterfly, while also being able to contain them. Also, taking them out into the sun, I think a good amount of solar radiation is able to make it through those white, and I should have mentioned that they're white paper bags, and they're sturdy and have just prove to be really useful for us.
Thank you.
Hey, Clint, it's Ian here. I have a bigger picture question, and you might have touched on this a little bit. I think a lot about climate change and environmental change. What do you think the future of these butterflies is with two things? Climate change, so in our area, maybe increasing precipitation and warming temperatures. And then with all the restoration efforts that are underway and the dune systems. I don't know how much these butterflies use that part of the landscape, but if that's a direction we're going with climate change, what do you think the implications are?
Well, I'll answer the second part of your question first. The locations where these occur are often less dune system oriented, but climate change is a major concern for us. We've seen with Oregon silver spots, a disarticulation between when the butterflies are out and when there's enough nectar for those butterflies to feed upon. And so whenever we have shifting phenologies of the butterflies and the plants, we can see major issues in the future, especially with changes in warming and precipitation. How we're going to address that, I'm not quite sure, but it's definitely a major concern.
Thanks, Clint.
Clint, you mentioned that these are non-migratory butterflies, but in their univoltine life, how far can they go, and do they interact with other metapopulations? Or are you looking at other patches of populations and how they interact as well? Is that part of your study? Excellent
question. I think that some of our marking might let us know about how far the barren silver spots can go. I do know that there was Oregon silver spot that was marked, and it's the longest, or there were multiple ones marked, but the longest one, or the longest flight or distance between it being marked and it being recited is 4.25 kilometers, or I'm sorry, 4.25 miles. So they can fly fairly far. Being out in the habitats, I often don't see them on flights that are like that. My guess is that's a multiple hops, over multiple days to make it that far. But about 4.25 miles is what we consider the maximum dispersal distance for these. And there are, small pockets of individuals that are within that dispersal distance from each other. So maybe with some of the marking that we've done and putting them in different places, especially if we can, mark the different release sites in different colors, we can start to get an idea about some of those dynamics and which ones might be moving from one spot to another, and if that differs with males and females.
Thank you.
I have a question that is based on something a butterfly biologist told me once, which was that the Oregon silver spot butterfly, he said, feeds on tansy ragwort, and that some well-meaning person who spent an hour and a half eradicating a population of tansy ragwort could wipe out an Oregon silver spot population. And I've always wondered that, I look at a lot of the invasives or even the non-invasive non-natives that bloom at certain times of year, and I just wonder how much food for these types of pollinators that they're providing. And do you think that's true about the tansy ragwort?
Yeah, we have very good data to show that the tansy ragwort was the most preferred nectar source for Oregon silver spots in Del Norte County. And I've thought a lot about why that might be. Tansy ragwort is a yellow composite, and that's definitely sort of the most preferred growth type for the Oregon silver spots to go after. So is it a matter of just, what's available, what they're seeing, what they're running into? It's like, it's easiest to eat the things that are the easiest to get to. I can definitely see that. And We don't really know if there's any differences in the quality or the abundance of nectar from the tansy ragwort. But that's something that we're definitely concerned about, because it is an invasive species that's sort of propping up an endangered species. And we're working on restoration at Tallowwood Dunes to increase the native nectar density, such that maybe the Oregon silver spots could shift their preferences from tansy ragwort to yarrow, pearly everlasting, gum plant, things such as that. Unfortunately, the population of Oregon silver spots in Delaware County we haven't observed any adults there in the past 2 years. And so we're looking at potentially, upon confirmation of absence, which is very difficult, bringing in Oregon individuals to that area. So in the meantime, we would hope to be able to bring in a bunch of native nectar sources and have them sort of be accustomed to the native nectar ahead of time, and maybe sidestep this issue in the future.
Really interesting. Thank you.
Sorry, Jen. I've got another question here in the chat for you, Clint, from Laura. Is there a reason why the project focused on catching female butterflies in the wild instead of starting with butterflies that were bred in captivity?
Great question. It's because they mate more readily in the wild than we're able to get them to mate in captivity. We've had very, very little success with captive mating in any Bay Area species. And so, they know how to find each other in the wild, and we rely upon that. And also, that really reduces some of our regulatory burden on our permitting side as well. Captive breeding efforts require another layer of review and additional layers of reporting, as well as the maintenance of all sort of a genetic and breeding records. So it's easier for us, and it's easier for the butterflies to do it this way.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'll just give it another few seconds. If we have any more questions for Clint, feel free to speak up. But yeah, just want to say thank you to all of our presenters. We went from really kind of big picture climate resiliency down to little butterflies and butterfly conservation. So I think it's great topics all around. Thanks to everybody for being here. We do these meetings once a year for the Dunes Co-op, so keep an eye out for next November, another meeting with some more topics. Maybe we'll be able to do it in person next year. But yeah, thanks everybody for being here. The recording will be available soon, and I will send out an email when it is.